Lepo pozdravljeni, dragi panelisti, ekscelence, gospod Načkov. I was thought I should speak English. Translation has been assured. So, welcome, dear distinguished panelists. I would say to Mr. Dreher, welcome back to Ljubljana. We have already two books of Mr. Dreher, one book of Mr. Legutka, and we are waiting for the first of Mr. Stalowitz. And I would say it's a privilege to moderate this discussion on demons of democracy. I think we will deal with diagnosis, but also with the therapy. And I'm thankful to all three conservative legendary thinkers for their work, because you work on understanding what is happening, and without understanding we cannot do much, I would say. No? And it is very important that we are able to use the right words, you were taught yesterday already where you landed, I would say. We spoke a few minutes ago about the holiday we had to celebrate, the date on which nothing happened, in fact, because on 27th, the so-called Liberation Front or Svobodna Fronta was not established. One day, another front was established, but that was called Protiimperialistična Fronta, anti-imperialistic front, which supported pact Stalin-Hitler. No? So these are particularities of our country. And I would mention only one more fact. In this country, we were able to elect the former first man of communist regime as the first Democrat of the country. So in Slovenia, communists were very successful in many respects. And maybe you were told already that in these days, especially last days, the old terminology from 42 or 45 or even 89 is again in use. Yesterday, I know that a cyclist who had to wait for a tractor to pass by was shouting at that young man on the tractor, fascist. You know, we speak about fascists, about traitors. I mean, the concept of the enemy is back, not only in this country. Mr. Legutka was very clear with that in his book, but I would say let's start with the question, what we are not aware of, because you work on understanding. What we understand in this societal or political or cultural situation, and what we don't understand. I remember my good friend, former Vice Chancellor of Austria, Mr. Erhard Busek, when we met for the last time in Vienna, he said, Lojze, what did we do wrong? And this is one of the questions, but do you agree that the enemy is back?
Did you take the mic?
We spent 5 years together in the European Parliament with Mr. Legutka. So.
No? It is, okay. Yes and no. I mean, I think the problem with today's societies, in the Western world, Western societies, is that they do not seem to have a good sense of what they are, I mean, there is very little self-awareness. It's been said that we understand the times only when a certain period is coming to an end, right? Minerva's owl flies at dusk, right? It was Hegel who said that. But it's not necessarily so. The problem with, I think, the major problem of today is that we have a very inaccurate and false picture of the society in which we live. Part of the reason is, and I talked about it yesterday, that the language we use is a mendacious language, is a language that lies. So the major concepts which we use do not mean what they should mean, but they mean the reverse. I know when I meet somebody who starts talking about tolerance, I know that I should run for life because he's a dangerous man. And the same goes for pluralism, right? Or diversity, or democracy for that matter. So, if I can use the somewhat Marxist language, the human mind has been so mystified or alienated that does not really recognize the things as they are. It's extremely difficult to talk about the dangerous, the threats to freedom today, because all these threats and limitations to freedom are not recognized as threats to and limitations of freedom, but I consider to be the expressions of freedom, right? At the university campus, when a guest or invited speaker is silenced or is deplatformed, or sometimes is assaulted physically, that's considered to be an expression of freedom, not an attack of freedom. And I could give you many examples. The institutions, the international institutions, such as the European Union, are particularly, I would say, proficient in this language and mystifying the picture of the world. So my point is that, well, you have to start with the language and call the things for what they are. I call a spade a spade. Identify things and do not be lured by this mendacious language.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Legutka. You mentioned lying, and you wrote a book about it. What would you add in that regard? What do you consider as the main lie today?
Well, I think that the main deception, and it's a self-deception that we in the West face, is the idea that totalitarianism is something from the past. It's something from the Soviet world. It's something from George Orwell's 1984. That's actually not true. We are living through the emergence of a new form of totalitarianism that has more to do with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World than with Orwell's 1984. A few years back in the US, I began to hear from people who had come to the United States from the Warsaw Pact nations and from Russia to escape communism. And they all began to say the things that they could see emerging in America today remind them of what they left behind. And often they struggled to articulate it, but they could feel it in their bones. Well, it sounded absurd, but the more I talked to them, the more I realized, no, they're understanding something that the rest of us Americans are blind to. What were they seeing? They were seeing people suddenly losing their jobs or facing social exclusion for holding the wrong opinion, for saying the wrong things, for saying things that yesterday were perfectly fine, but today they're forbidden, and so on and so forth. They were seeing the line between good and evil drawn between racial groups and favored sexual classes, as in the Soviet days they were drawn between economic classes, and so on and so forth. But Americans and Western Europeans struggle to see that, because when we think of totalitarianism, we think of gulags and secret police and bread lines, things like that. In fact, Hannah Arendt said that even a liberal democracy can be totalitarian if we understand totalitarianism as an ideology that tries to control all aspects of reality, in which the personal is political. And that's what we're living with today. I'll give you a concrete example. When I was in Budapest doing research for Live Not by Lies, I was traveling on a tram with my interpreter, a young Hungarian woman, a Catholic. And she said, Rod, I'm struggling with my friends, even my Catholic friends, to talk to them about the troubles in my life. I tell them, my husband and I are arguing these days, or our little boy is keeping us up late at night. They immediately say, oh, you have to get a divorce. You have to put your child in daycare. Go back to work. You have to be happy. She said, I tell them, wait, I am happy. I'm happy being a wife. I'm happy being a mother. But a happy life doesn't mean a life without problems. She said, none of them can understand it. And I looked at her and said, Anna, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. She said, that's it. Where did you get that? I said, chapter 17 of Huxley's Brave New World. In that chapter, the dissident, John the Savage, meets the world controller for Europe. And it's not like Winston Smith in 1984 meeting O'Brien. The world controller for Europe says, why wouldn't you join us? We take care of everything. We give you drugs for pleasure, pornography, comfort, etc., etc. Why wouldn't you be part of this? And John the Savage says, because it's not human. And the world controller says, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. John says, I am fighting for that right, and I'm fighting for love, and for God, and for sin, and for reality. And the world controller says, be my guest. My contention is today we are living in a world in which all of us are conditioned to accept servility to the machine for the sake of our own comfort and for removing anxiety. We have lost a sense of what it means to be human. And unlike in the Soviet days, this is not coming necessarily from on top down. This is coming from everywhere. You don't need a government to order a totalitarian regime when all the institutions in your society, including big business, the US military, the media, academia, when they're all believe the same things, the same ideology.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Sullivan, I think there are elements to comment.
Yes.
What do you think about this? I would say continuity of totalitarianism, which was transformed. Now we have former communists in liberal or social democratic clothing.
Yes.
And one more memory from Slovenia. Communists for 45 years.
You have to use the microphone. Otherwise,
I think
there will be no interpretation.
There is no. Also, then please.
Sure.
I was sure that one was active. For the Communist Party, which was ruling power in this country for 45 years, there was no to Europe. Europe, no. But at the beginning of the change, their slogan was Europe now. Yeah. So this, I mentioned this in the context of what you state or what you wrote in your books about the transforming power of the communists to adapt to the new situation. What would you say to that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that, you know, I'm a journalist and a writer, and of course we're all hoping that we will say things or write things that will get into the dictionary of quotations. And I gave a fairly important lecture, the Keith Joseph Lecture, 20-odd years ago in England, and it ended with what I hope was a brilliant aphorism, which was, like history, as Marx said of history, socialism repeats itself. The first time as genocide, the second time as therapy. and in fact, no one has ever repeated it, by the way. So it may sound fresh. Now, how did this happen? Because there is, I mean, what we have at the moment is socialism as applied to the therapeutic society that Philip Rieff wrote about in the 60s. Well, in 1986, I was on the London Times, and the editor was invited by the Foreign Office to meet a Hungarian apparatchik, communist apparatchik, and he couldn't go, and he asked me to, asked me to take his place. I had a most fascinating lunch. The apparatchik was fairly senior, and he said as follows: well, we reformers have just been defeated in a meeting of the Supreme Soviet or whatever. He said, we knew it would happen, and we're not worried. We are going to carry on winning in this one. This was a small setback. And in about 2 or 3 years, we will be in a situation in which we can have multi-party elections. And I said, well, aren't you going to lose them? He said, oh yes, we'll be severely defeated. And the Communist Party will then split in two. There'll be about 10% of us who will become hardline socialists and communists and become increasingly irrelevant as our electorate dies. But the rest of us are going to become social democrats, and we'll accept the rules of the democratic game. And of course, we're going to be the second democratic government, because the country is in such a mess that the first democratic government is a suicide mission. The very word, by the way, that Joseph Antal used to describe his own prospects when he became Prime Minister. So, first of all, I think is that our former, our present opponents, our former enemies, had thought about this very carefully, because it was plain, and I think this emerges very strongly from Richard's book, that communism was a failing concern. It was a company that was about to go bankrupt, and the question was who would be the receivers, who would receive it, and they thought about it. I think that in Hungary, initially at least, the Social Democrats, former communists, thought about it more successfully than the left did in Poland, because the initial impact of the left of liberty was to destroy the left and to replace it with you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Richard, a government and an opposition that was really Whig versus Tory, the two different wings of the solidarity movement. And the left didn't disappear, it continued to hold important cultural institutions, but nonetheless it wasn't really for a while part of the political structure. So, first of all, they thought about it, they planned for post-death politics, and they have by and large succeeded in different ways in different political systems. What also happened? What happened was that in West and East, the end of the Cold War produced a new kind of post-national politics. Now, I remember writing as a journalist, I wrote a lot about this without quite understanding how far it would go. When there were the debates over joining, over the Maastricht Treaty, which was the beginning of a serious move towards the political unification of the EU as opposed to economic unification. When that was happening, I noticed that more and more decisions were being moved away from national democratic institutions to international institutions, sometimes global ones, sometimes European ones, and also domestically to semi-independent bureaucracies and to the courts. So it was plain that we were moving from a democratic system to one that was a mixed democratic system and a kind of system of what I'd call, well, you could call it autocratic liberalism, or some such phrase. But anyway, power was, and political decisions were not made wholly, or indeed sometimes even principally, by institutions by parliaments, but more and more by non-accountable, non-democratic institutions, which gradually accumulated more and more power. Thirdly, as I mentioned in my initial line, quote, being a movement from genocide to therapy, I had been involved, I'd helped to start an organization that was set up to get the Central European countries, in fact, Central Europe and Eastern Europe, into the institutions of Euro-Atlantic cooperation. It was called the New Atlantic Initiative, and our aims were to get countries like Slovenia into the EU and into NATO. And I'm glad we did that. I think it was important. But I never for a moment thought I would live in a Europe in which the central authorities in Brussels would be dictating such rules as the nature of the family, and secondly, whether or not doctors and nurses who do not wish to participate in euthanasia or abortions would be denied the right of conscientious objection. And yet, that is a serious proposal which is being advanced in Central European institutions. So it never occurred to me that Europe could become a kind of soft authoritarianism or even soft totalitarianism. But of course, it's important because as long as the final decisions in a political system are subject to the voters, are subject to some form of democratic control in the old-fashioned sense, then the country can in fact resist or yield voluntarily to new movements of therapeutic liberalism. In fact, and that's what is happening, the social, we blundered yesterday on your way to your meeting, Richard, into a meeting of the Social Democrats. It was very impressive. It looked terribly well funded, packed with young people, very impressive stage and organization. And yet at the same time, the rhetoric, we only stayed for 5 minutes, but the rhetoric that was rolling out was a kind of baffle-gab. It seemed to mean terribly important things, but really it was a surrender of thought and a surrender of independent activity to the system of Europe, which has increasingly become the final authority, which ensures that, well, I will put it as low as this, it is difficult to escape social democratic and soft authoritarian solutions on everything from the state of European defense to the question of abortion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I like very much the notion soft totalitarianism. I think this is the right word. But Mr. Legutko, you mentioned the question, you said who we are. And I think it would be good to dedicate a few minutes to the question of the identity today. I think is a very essential issue, very essential point. What would you say? What is happening to today identity? You know, 30 years ago, we had different ideas or experiences with liberalism, also with social democracy. We learned that the European Union was not established in order to finish with identities, but to have different attitudes toward so many identities in Europe. What is going on now?
Yes, something is going on, definitely. Yeah, I remember a long time ago reading Francis Fukuyama's book on the end of the history of the last man, and I was quite impressed by this book. Not so by the essay he had published before, but the book seemed to be quite interesting. I understood it in the way that we have our political imagination is not able to produce or to go beyond a certain concept of political order, like a multi-party system, civic liberties, stable constitution or law. That seems to be obvious. There is the problem also who will operate these institutions. And Fukuyama's Fukuyama defended the last man, right? Friedrich Nietzsche's last man, whom he interpreted as, oh yes, he doesn't have these great ideas that were associated with the classical concept of the human nature. He didn't have thymos, right? The Greek word for this sort of energetic, right, part of our soul. He's interested in consuming things and producing things, but he is able to function in the world and behave decently and do not really lose a sense of orientation. And I found it quite persuasive. I said, why not? If somebody wants to have some stronger inspiration for human destiny, then you can find it in Christianity or in classical metaphysics. But then I remember reading another book by John Fonte, a man you know very well, who had the argument which opened my eyes. No, this is not the end of history. This is not the end of that our political imagination has been exhausted. No, we going forward, so to speak, right? We are creating a new international order, giving the competences, giving the power to international or global, right, or continental supranational institutions that are not accountable to the voters. And we are doing it willingly. And that, of course, changes the concept of human nature. And this last men about whom Fukuyama was speaking were not good, well formed bourgeois right characters with a sense of prudence and propriety. These are people who have lost or are losing the control not only of what they do, but of what they are, and of a sense of responsibility. A large part of what they do and what they see is conditioned by somebody else, not by themselves. But they find comfort in it. It's like exactly as Rod said, right? In the Brave New World. So what we have nowadays, I think, the danger that we see is that more and more people consider themselves to be free, irresponsible, whereas the conditions within which they functions are not of their own making. So that's why there is this mixture of rhetoric that we encounter today. On the one hand, right? Freedom, liberation, and on the other hand, a sense of helplessness and a loss of a sense of direction and everything that follows from it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just because of the translation. Thank you, Mr. Legutko. So, what can we achieve without knowing who we are?
Nothing. And I would go even further. We can't achieve anything good without reclaiming in a very strong way our Christian faith. I think that what we're living through today, this apocalypse, is a direct result of the de-Christianization of the West. And I'll give you an example. Back in 2015, I spoke to a group of Protestants, like evangelicals. It was a private group. I was the only non-Protestant there. They wanted me to talk about my Benedict option idea. But the other fellow speaking was a political scientist. And he was talking to us right after the US Supreme Court ruled that gay marriage is constitutional in the US. This man, who was a Christian, said to the group, this was a loss for us, a loss for the family, and we shouldn't downplay it. But it's not remotely the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that can happen, he said, is if transgenderism goes mainstream. Why? Because that speaks to the nature of man himself. If transgenderism, he said, becomes mainstream, then all is lost. Well, 6 months after he spoke, Time magazine in the US had on the cover the transgender moment, and it's been, we all know what happened after that. Now, in this day in the United States, in several of the more liberal states, the government can seize a child from the parents and do surgery on the child and do chemical transition on the child if the child wants to be transitioned, even if the parents don't like it. Now, people who grew up under communism understand exactly what's going on here. But in America, this is increasingly called freedom. And you don't even see many of the national Republicans speaking out against this. Now, I think this is important to the question of identity for this reason. I think the transgender person is the epitome of the new man, of the last man, or the last person. We don't know what they are, because it is they stand for the final triumph of the human will over nature. The transgendered person is someone who believes that the thing that is most intimate to their nature, their maleness or their femaleness, can be overcome with technology and by changing language and by changing law, that they can completely dominate and reframe reality. There's a reason why this is happening too with the generation of the young today who have been formed in their minds online with social media, with video games. They come to believe that reality is something very plastic, something malleable, and that their own identity is something that must be chosen, not something received, but chosen. And to deny this sort of thing in the United States, even among people who would not accept transgenderism, to say that no, there are some things that are real that you don't get to choose, that seems like heresy, you know? And this is our problem. If we think that identity is something that we choose, 100% that we choose, and that to deny someone's choice or to criticize their choice is the same thing as criticizing their own humanity, their own person, then we are in a world of trouble. And that's exactly where we are.
Thank you. Mr. Salvan, would you agree that the weakening or a relativization of the identity is a kind of favor of soft totalitarianism?
Yes, I would, very much would. And I would talk about two different aspects of identity in the case of Britain. I grew up in a country which I think was undeniably a very free country. I mean, I never remember, once outside the question of obeying one's parents, I never remember when I felt I couldn't say what I thought. It was just automatically, everybody did say exactly what they thought. And an argument as Orwell points this out, an argument in a pub between people of different views could be amicably ended by the statement, well, it's a free country. In other words, we're entitled to disagree. And that was frequently said. Now, one of the aspects of that country was that it was an Anglican country. I grew up as a Catholic, and I'm a Catholic, and I remember, of course, we had, my early years, we had still the kind of notion of fortress Catholicism. We were a fortress being defended against the sea of heresy, and that was quite effectively done. But it gradually, I think that eroded as a result of common experiences in the Second War, particularly. Any kinds of bigotry became increasingly hard to believe in and to sustain. And so anti-Christian divisions became less serious over time. And that resulted in my slightly re-evaluating Anglicanism, partly because I used to go to a lot of Anglican weddings. I learned to appreciate the beauty of the Anglican liturgy and the language of the King James Bible and Anglican hymns. I never ceased in any way being a Catholic, but I developed an affection for Anglicanism. It's hard to sustain that affection now because Anglicanism has, in a sense, surrendered so many of its principles that it's hard to see it sustaining itself long. It's in a state of great decay. I hope that doesn't continue, but that's true at the moment. So an important element in English identity has gone, which was, even though I was a Catholic, I recognized I was in an Anglican country, and I didn't mind it. I didn't feel I was among enemies. I felt I was among cousins, right? Now, that, of course, is no longer the case, and the element of identity, of Christian identity, has eroded along with the strength and vitality and faith, I think, of the Anglican Church. And I think that's a problem. The second, political identity. Well, a British identity is obviously a slight problem. It's like Yugoslav identity in a sense. I mean, it's the identity of 4 different nations united into one, but still having a common British identity. That's come under direct political challenge from Scottish nationalists, from Irish nationalists, even from Welsh nationalists, and that wasn't much of a problem. It was easily accommodated. It still is reasonably easily accommodated, though in Scotland not so easily. But the entry into Europe, I think, gradually sapped that identity in an important way. On the one hand, being in Europe and suffering the interventions of Europe and the changes demanded of Britain, left most English people feeling this wasn't what we wanted and we don't want to stay. But there was a very significant section of the populace, I would say the university educated, 15 to 20%. It's now actually 45% of Britons go to university, but nonetheless it's the people who go to the really good ones that count. And you now have a significant section of the British people, as Brexit illustrated, who felt they were being deprived of their more important European identity. And that has created a serious fissure in English society. It's very hard for a society which is riven about its identity, which on 3 grounds, national, European, and religious, the English society now is, to act confidently either at home or on the world stage. And I think their battles are still going on and will continue to go on. I can't actually firmly predict how they will end up. But if they end up with the British, in a sense, abandoning their identity, it's very hard to know what kind of identity is going to replace it, except that, in my view, it would almost certainly be a worse one.
Can I add to that?
Please do.
Yeah.
I want to add briefly, I think that one of the problems we face is the collapse of a strong Christian identity. In my country, the United States, there are no religious leaders, none that I can think of, who are standing up in any strong way against the forces that are disintegrating the family, disintegrating freedom of religion, and other things like that. I think it's so difficult for American Christians, Protestant, Catholic, whatever, to think that to be a good Christian might require you to be on the outside of society, might require you to take a stand against what your government wants you to do, against what the mainstream of society wants. Because for so long, there was no felt distinction between being a faithful Christian and being a good American, a conformist middle-class American. Well, that's over now. But American Christians are struggling to understand that and don't want to understand it because they don't want to feel like aliens in their own country. But in my book, Live Not by Lies, I traveled to the former communist countries of Eastern Europe and to Russia, asking Christians who stayed behind and were dissidents against communism, I asked them, what should we in the West, in the United States and Western Europe, understand about how to resist this anti-Christian philosophy? Every one of them said the most important thing is being willing to suffer. You have to know who you are and who you belong to, God, and be willing to prove it through suffering, whether it's small suffering like being kicked out of a social group or losing your job, or it may come to prison or even worse. Whatever it is, you have to be ready to suffer. Because if you're not ready to suffer for your faith, if you are not so convinced of the truth of the Christian faith, then you will not make it through what's to come. Whether it's soft or turns hard, you won't make it through what's to come. And that taught me that the essence of this soft totalitarianism is from Huxley, from Brave New World, that people are so afraid of suffering or even being anxious that they will surrender their freedom, surrender their identity, even change their faith, as the German bishops are doing, to conform to this anti-Christian new order.
Can I say?
Thank you. Please do. We are entering deeper waters.
An East European perspective, I remember when the old regime fell and the new system was being built, then the new elite, the new political and cultural elite, they began describing the new political project in terms of a change of identity. Now we are entering a new world, a modern world, so we have to have a modern identity, right? A new identity. And that was the reason why the former communists and the new social democratic or liberal or left-wing elite found a common language, because that was exactly what the communists had been doing previously, right? They were trying to replace the old identity with the new one. That didn't work. Now there came new forces, new situation. Hey, right? They remember the good heroic days, and they joined the forces. And now in the European Parliament, the former communists, at least from my country, are exemplary Europeans, right? Fighting for the brave new world.
So I think we would need several more days to discuss very strong points, but I would like to finish respecting the limited time we have with the final question or final round, and I think it's time to say something about the truth. I remember 30 years ago, the situation or the picture was very clear. We knew what was wrong. We understand that there is a better world. We wish to join. And today, everything seems to be fluid or more foggy. We don't have such clear alternatives. And now we don't speak about lies, but about fake news. No? And we have artificial intelligence, which is able to write articles, essays, and so on. So we are in a different situation. And how can we deal with the question of the truth in this situation? We can't do progress without respecting truth, but it seems that people are not interested in truth. This is, I would say, a very big challenge for all of us. So, who would like to start?
I can, whatever.
Well, no.
I think people are very interested in truth, which is why they spend such a lot of time denying it doesn't exist. Of course, again, an aspect of life growing up, I remember, in England of the 50s and 60s, was I used to read The Spectator and The New Statesman, respectively the weekly magazines of left and right, and that service reasonably high intellectual quality. And they used to be fierce controversies. A book review would receive the next week an angry letter disputing its arguments point by point. And then the next week, the review author would be responding, and it really seemed to matter. And some of these debates were with very distinguished people. I remember George Lukács reviewing The Constitution of Liberty by Hayek in The New Statesman, and not in a particularly friendly way. So you were living in a society in which there was a fundamental social harmony, it seems to me looking back, which was not in any serious way undermined by fierce specific controversies, or even fierce general ones. There were religious arguments across the dinner table. There were political arguments in the pub. They were meant in a serious way. They generally didn't end in fights. Occasionally they did, of course, in pubs. But these things, this was a society which in an everyday way, without thinking a lot about it, recognized truth and recognized also common values, which even when they were disputed. There were Marxists who would say that they didn't believe England was a free country. And yet, as Orwell pointed out in a very funny passage, he says, when they're engaged in some other controversy, they forget what they're supposed to believe, and you get a Marxist law professor writing to the Times saying that some Tory government bill is an outrageous assault on British liberties, which he's not supposed to believe in the first place. And so, in a sense, the arguments over the attempt to drive truth from the public arena is an acceptance that particularly I will say that in a multicultural society, and even in a multi-religious society in which the wounds are still raw, truth becomes a matter of difficulty and embarrassment. But by 1950, the British had passed that phase, and I could interview, and did. As a young journalist, I interviewed the leader of the Protestant party on the Liverpool City Council, whom I found to be an extremely reasonable person, and not the bigot I'd been expecting to meet, who was capable of perfectly rational arguments in which his criticisms of the Catholic Church was simply anxieties about its attitude to civil liberties. So, I mean, truth is important. Truth is being banished because to accept its central importance in our lives would mean that we would have to have serious arguments with each other, and in a society which has got a significant number of different religions, that worries the authorities.
Thank you. Truth from United States and from Budapest.
Well, 40 years ago, the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre observed in his book After Virtue that truth today in contemporary society is a matter of emotion. we can no longer have many meaningful arguments because we deny the same grounds from which to argue. And so arguments become simply a matter of asserting emotional beliefs. This has become completely mainstream in the United States, at least. And we shouldn't imagine that it's only between, the division is between left and right. You can find many people on my side, on the conservative side, who are equally willing to believe truths that ratify or their own, what they wish to believe. Hannah Arendt, in her great 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, warned that one sign of coming totalitarianism is a society in which truth ceases to matter to people, and rather they just seek arguments that tell them what they already believe is true is true. I think that for anyone who wishes to live in truth and in reality today has to fight for it, because the usual places that we used to go for truth, you used to be able to believe the media, you used to be able to believe the church, your professors. So much of that authority has been compromised, but truth is still there. We just have to fight for it. And as I said earlier, we have to be willing to suffer for the truth. And that, one of my favorite stories that I learned in reporting my book is from Václav Havel, his famous parable of the greengrocer in the communist city. He takes down the sign that says, "Workers of the world unite," because he doesn't want to live this lie anymore. What happens to him? The secret police come, they arrest him, they take his store away. He is reduced to sweeping the streets to make his living. But he's gained a great victory. He has gained not only his integrity, but he has shown to the world that if you are willing to suffer, you can live in the truth. And in time, a system built on lies will fall. That's what we have to hope in. And I believe, I'll end with this. When I was interviewing these Christians from the communist world, not one of them believed they would live to see the end of communism. They stood for truth, they argued for truth, they suffered for truth, because it was right in the eyes of God. And that is the hope we have to have. 5 years ago, I was in Paris talking to Alain Finkielkraut, one of the leading intellectuals there today, who is an atheist. And we were agreeing that things look very, very bad for Europe. And I said to him, "Professor, where do you find hope?" He said, "I have no hope." I said, "I do have hope, and my hope is in Jesus Christ. But please don't think I'm saying that like a TV evangelist. I'm not optimistic. I think things are going to get bad. But I believe that as long as we are willing to suffer and offer our sufferings to Christ, that He will redeem those sufferings. Those sufferings have value, even if we don't live to see it. And that is what Christian hope is." He looked at me and said, "Well, that's good for you Americans, but here in France, we don't believe in God." End of story. And I realized this despair is not going to survive what's coming. But Christians who hope and who stand in truth and who are willing to suffer for the truth, no matter what, we will be the ones who will survive this and be there to renew the world once this dark winter leaves us.
Well, in almost every handbook on the history of philosophy, you will read a statement to the effect that it was Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud who subverted the notion of the truth, because what they say is that our ideas, our opinions are the results of a deeper conditioning or interests or social context. So the truth doesn't exist as such. It's not neutral, it's not a reflection of reality, it's a reflection of our complexes, interests, and so on. And that was taken over by the sociologists and philosophers, sociologists, and then truth was becoming slowly discredited, which had, of course, a very serious effect on the world we live in. For example, it changed the concept of education, right? Schools, universities. There are less and less places when you learn to discover the truth, but you learn about points of view, or you want to you're trying to adapt your mind to the actual context and political struggle. So, pursuit of truth as a pursuit of truth as a disinterested activity is no longer something that is considered viable or even attractive. If you talk to the presidents or the directors of the university, very rarely do you find them talking about the truth or the pursuit of truth. Now, behind this, there is a sort of cliche argument that it's good that we got rid of the truth or marginalized it, because truth is politically dangerous. It makes you intransigent. If you believe something to be true, you're becoming a fanatic, a crusader, and you do not tolerate any dissenters, because it is the truth, your truth, that matters. This is of course, a ridiculous statement. I would say it's the other way round. That is, if the truth does not exist, the only way to settle the differences of opinion is through violence. Yeah. Right? How else can you take the upper hand in a dispute if there are no objective criteria to settle the matter? Only by use of violence. And that's exactly what has been happening today, right? There are no public debates. The word debate or the dialogue is another of those contaminated, distorted concepts. What is happening is simply you get rid of your opponents. You discredit them, you stigmatize them, you push them outside the area of respectability. And until we restore and we recover and rehabilitate the concept of truth as a major concept for every human mind, we will not have a civilized discourse. It always be, as Lenin said, right, whom. Right, it's the only way that the conflicts can be solved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Very strong words were pronounced: suffering, violence, truth, pleasure. I would say I would wish to have a long conference on suffering and pleasure. Suffering is not very political slogan, I would say, but as a Christians, we know what does it mean. I think we have still some time to allow audience to say something after what the panelists shared with us. Anybody would like to take the floor? Dr. Turk.
So, panelists and Mr. Peterle, thank you very much for this inspiring conversation. Now, I'm not provoking, not at all, but there will be something. As I was preparing my book, The War in the Name of Peace, that's about the profound crisis of values within the European framework, within the framework of European institutions, and generally in the West. I was asking a fundamental question because we were after the revolution of '68 getting to an atmosphere where the truth was removed off. And I was asking very profoundly, because there is only one truth, so that would be originally there's only one truth, and this truth is Christianity. And I was asking myself, what was the role of Vatican II Council in all these events? And more I was reflecting upon it, more I was becoming to think that it could be a major mistake that the Church has made in its history, but it did not generally make any mistake. So, but I'm not provoking. I'm not traditional Catholic. I'm just an ordinary Catholic. I do not know if there's something like a traditional Latin Mass in Ljubljana or in Slovenia. I do not know. I have never interested myself in it. But first, for the time when I was writing my book, there's something that is coming to my mind that perhaps that was a great mistake. But just to finish, I'm not provoking. Just searching for an answer. Thank you very much.
It's about the Second Vatican Council.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Maybe we collect 3 questions.
Yeah.
Gentleman behind.
I was going to ask about the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm possibly the youngest person here.
Can you tell your name, please?
My name is Zig. I'm a journalist for the Modena otherwise.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of words said about identity and how crucial it is for maintaining our thing we have here. And as a young person, I noticed a trend that's been in the last few months, especially, but also in the last few years, where the young people in the Anglo-Saxon world are getting more and more like woke, let's say, anti-nationalist, anti-ethnic, anti-religious, and so on, which is different from the previous generations that were getting more and more conservative in years. But in the continental Europe, the trend seems to be opposite. Like some research showed it, like young people are voting actually more right-wing, not even moderate right-wing, but often like these more hardline right-wing parties. For example, Le Pen in France had more support with young people than Macron did. Or in Scandinavian countries, young people are voting more Christian or more, at least more conservative, let's say. And since we have 2 people from continental Europe and 2 people from Anglo-Saxon world, why do you think this is, like, why is the trend opposite on one side of the Atlantic, or include UK, and in continental Europe it would be different? Is it maybe a reason for some optimism, or is it just something that in history would be known as early 2020s?
Well, thank you. One more, maybe. If not, we will. Oh, so Shane, Who would like to start? Please.
Well, the Vatican II, yes, I think that was a mistake. That is, the Vatican II was called a pastoral council, right? Not dogmatic, nothing about dogmas, but pastoral. In fact, it was about strategy, but I think the strategy became more important than the truth, right, or the creed itself. It became a process of the church adapting herself to the situation, presumably in the hope of having more, of enlarging the flock, so to speak, right? But that's I think that's a mistake, because you become a slave to the strategy that you use, and that trend continues. So I think it was a serious mistake, and that was the change of liturgy that followed the Vatican II, right, at the end of the 1960s. So English and American friends who are Catholics were telling me that it was a heavy blow for them because Latin was something that distinguished them. When you live in a Protestant country, Latin is something that distinguishes you, right, from the Protestants. So yes, I think I would tend to agree with you about the young people. I don't know. I mean, it's very interesting what you said. That it's true that in my country, my party, this Conservative Party, had still the largest support among young people, larger than the left-wing parties. So when I go to I usually go to a Tridentine Mass, and about 75% of people, and the church is full, are young people. I don't know what it means, but this is you can see it, yeah? which is good. Yeah.
Anglo-Saxon view?
Well, I won't say much about the Second Vatican Council. I'm Orthodox, not Catholic, but I will say that in the United States, there was a total collapse of catechesis after the council. You have now 2 generations of American Catholics who were not taught what the church believes is true, and there was even a shocking poll a few years ago showing that only a small minority of American Catholics believe that the Eucharist is really the body and blood of Jesus. They were never taught it. So the weakness of the Catholic Church in America is profound, and it comes out of the Second Vatican Council. It's not my place to say if the council was a mistake or not, but I will say that at least the implementation of it in the United States was catastrophic. On the second question, a really interesting one about wokeness. A few years ago, there was a political scientist in the US, Zachary Goldberg, who did a deep dive into the records of all the media, the words that were used in the mainstream media going way back. And he found that around the year 2012, there was a shocking shift. If you look at the charts, words and phrases like white supremacy, whiteness, all of these woke phrases shot up like a rocket. Just went up like 500, sometimes 1,000%, and suddenly began appearing in the media everywhere. Now you have a generation of young people who spend their lives online, on their phones, and these phrases were constantly being repeated in the mainstream media and passed around on smartphones and on social media among the young people. This had a profound effect, I'm sure. And I have a 23-year-old son who is sadly on the left, but he said, Dad, we grew up with Donald Trump. His idea, my son's idea, and his generation's idea of conservatism is Donald Trump. Not Ronald Reagan, that was my generation, but Donald Trump. And that, I think, has had a part of the great awakening as well. But they've also been raised finally in an environment in which they were coddled, we say. You know, they were told that any anxiety you have, we must deal with this. So you have these young people going into universities and believing that it is their right to tell professors what the professors can and cannot say. I was reading in the New York Times today, they were saying that Generation Z, the young people, the youngest one, they're the first ones to be fired because bosses can't deal with them. They believe that they get into the workplace and they have the right to dictate everything. So I think all of this is part of one basic idea of wokeness, the idea that that if you hold the correct opinions, politically correct opinions, then that justifies doing anything you want. It started with the media and embracing these concepts and it being widely spread on social media, and social media doing what it does, which is to enforce uniformity by making people who are dissidents, kicking them out.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, on the question of the Vatican Council, I join, or rather I follow, those Catholic like Father John Newhouse, the late Father John Newhouse and others, who distinguished between the Vatican Council on the one hand and the spirit of the Vatican Council on the other, because of the myth of the Vatican Council. I think the Vatican Council itself had many important good things in it. I think particularly, for example, the clarity of its acceptance of religious freedom, which was an important point I could make in my discussion with the leader of the Protestant party in the Liverpool Council. And on the other hand, there is the spirit of the council, and the spirit of the council, or the myth of the council, is what I think was well described by Rod a moment ago, namely the teaching of certain key doctrines was downplayed or not played at all. That would be particularly true of Humanae Vitae, where in both, I think, in confession, but in homilies, Catholic priests just ceased to, in a sense, interpret that at all as anything authoritative. They just treated it as if it was not an authoritative part of the magisterium. And that's led to a certain loss of faith, it seems to me, or a dilution of faith. I think the warning Catholics have, is that, just as you were saying, that East Europeans living in America come to Americans and say, this woke business, it's coming, it's dangerous, we remember what it was like under communism, that's what it was like. Well, equally, you can now see Catholics looking at the Anglican Church and saying, well, if we carry on this road, so to speak, we're going to end up with the replacement of the faith, the Anglican faith, which claimed to be Catholic and has some claim to that, becoming really little more than an Anglican elaboration of liberation theology.
Can you repeat that in German?
No, I'm afraid not. Now, the second point, I think you've got to, your distinction between the English-speaking world and the continental Europe is an important one, but there is the reason why woke culture is spreading in the English-speaking world is because it's a single political, moral and religious culture these days. There are regional differences in it. And of course, in some respects, English people seem different to Americans, who seem different to Australians, and so on and so forth. I don't want to downplay those differences, but it is true that if something is a big idea, a big movement, a big trend, in one of the major English-speaking countries, it will become known quickly in the others, and to a considerable extent, you will see the same trend making ground. Now, what about continental Europe? Well, continental Europe is more divided culturally than the English-speaking world is. And for that reason, therefore, you see wokeness spreading in some cases and being effectively non-existent in others. And I think you have to look at what is the political culture in each case and why it's being resisted. I think one clear sign about young people is it's very rare for young people to be strongly in favor of the governing party. I mean, so far as they have rebellious feelings, they tend to come out in relation to whichever is the government. And so you tend not to get the same response in every country. Since Hungary has a different type of governing party to Sweden, well, actually less so now, to France, and so on and so forth. So I would suggest that wokeness is something which will have a harder time penetrating the whole of Europe. Having said which, our good friend Frank Furedi, the sociologist, has made a specialty of looking at this, really says to all of his European friends, and from every country, it's coming for you. It's coming for you. You will not be exempt, whether you're Catholic or Protestant or Muslim, whatever. It will come to your country and it will spread, and you will lose your children unless you take strong measures to prevent that happening. And I think we have to remember that that's exactly true also of Marxism. After the First World War, it's everywhere. Now, it doesn't succeed everywhere, and sometimes the resistance to it is more painful than a disease, but nonetheless, these ideas do spread when the social soil is ready for them or open to them. And I think we can expect to have to fight wokeness for many years, because in all our societies it draws on passions which exist everywhere, and which have to be, first of all, opposed, but to be opposed effectively, they have to be understood and responded to intelligently.
Thank you very much, Gospod Rode. Last question, last comment, or last word, because he's the host of this event.
I just wanted to ask a question concerning the relationship between language and truth, which I think is very important. In a way, we live immersed in a language that is not telling the truth anymore, actually is subverting. And it happened to me a couple of weeks ago in a Catholic venue with a lot of youngsters, that I see, an elder generation telling them to just, at a specific point, follow their dreams, which is such an idealistic way of looking at the world, absolutely not realistic. We could at least tell them, I would say, know yourself, the classic idea, or follow the path, or discover the path that God, the God-given path within you. I think that as probably a first step towards the solution, I think we have to start by ourselves. We start to give you another example. For example, I know that The Guardian has a standard of words they are mandated to be used by their journalists, when they talk about pluralism, totalitarianism, and so on. We don't have such things. I'm talking about a company that works in journalism and book publishing and so on. And I think there's a lot of things to be done in this area, in the area of the usage of language. How do we use it? How do we actually end up taking, what this liberal order is offering us in terms of language? And we're just using it without really putting enough accent on maybe changing the words when needed, finding new words to actually address the younger generation properly and guiding them towards the truth. What's your thought on that?
Thank you. I would just add that we use the same words, but we think about different things.
Yeah. I would say that this is a special opportunity for you who grew up under communism to stand up and speak out, and not just an opportunity, but a duty. When I was researching Live Not by Lies, I was in Poland talking to a historian who lived under communism. He said, today we face a real problem in this country. He said, we who lived under communism can see how language is falsified in the media, globally and otherwise. But our children who were born after the end of communism, they're innocent of how this works. And it's so difficult to teach them, you have to be careful, watch this language. We know how the powers lie using language. And I think hearing this man talk about this made me realize what a gift it is to have lived under this false regime, this regime of lies, because you understand how it works, but you've got to tell your children. I talked to another man in Poland who said, we didn't tell our children about the communist years because we did not want to make their future dark. We wanted to let them build their own future without this memory. The problem with that is if you do not give your children a memory, share this memory with them, they will be children forever. They not to know what happened before you were born is to remain a child forever. Not to know what happened before the end of communism is not only to remain a child, but it is to be open to child abuse.
I think I want Richard as the philosopher to have the last word.
Yeah.
But but I would say there are certain writers who are indispensable to unmasking the attempts of others to tell lies through words, on the one hand, and also forcing us to confront our own use of language when we are being led by passion into dishonesty. I think the classic case, of course, is George Orwell. He wrote a wonderful essay called Politics in the English Language, which is precisely about this, and which says a lot of very sensible things which open your eyes. But I wouldn't confine myself to that particular essay, because his essay on nationalism is extremely useful and interesting. Even when you would disagree with him, you can see an honest mind attempting to grapple with the situation. But then again, I would also say, let's look for playwrights and poets who do the same thing. I think Tom Stoppard has a very playful use of words and concepts in his plays. I don't know how well Stoppard has been translated or shown in Slovenia. In the Czech Republic he has, because he's half Czech. Some of his plays are about the Czech communism, rock and roll, for example. But he did he did a very good television play about the Polish Revolution, which I don't know, it's been shown since it first came out, but he's done a lot of that. And in general, and I would say finally, a good historian who is not invariably honest and has a point of view is Macaulay, because Macaulay, in some of his essays, I think particularly Colloquies on Society, is incredibly funny at the expense of an ideological mind. In this case, an ideological Tory mind, namely Robert Sully, the poet and writer, and the way he deceives himself and attempts to deceive his readers in the use of words. So, I mean, I don't think you can improve upon reading clever and interesting and honest men and women writers who become fascinated by this problem and then write about it.
Yeah, it's true that we're being formatted. I mean, our language, if you work for a corporation or even if at the university you use the jargon, and you see the world through these jargons, which of course limits your view of the world. So the question is, what can we do about it? Yes, memory is important, but memory was one of the first objects of attack after the old regime fell, because memory keeps you rooted in the past, whereas we want to overcome the past and look into the radiant future. But I would say first literature. I greatly deplore the fact that young people, schools generally, do not require that the children learn poetry, or prose for that matter, by heart. Yeah. That is, you have to memorize. I mean, you have if you do not have phrases from poetry, from good poetry or from good writer, you will have the phrases from the commercials. Or from, you know. So I think this is extremely important. But this, again, is one of the prejudices, today's prejudices, that you cannot force young people to learn by heart, because this young person is a free spirit, right? And perhaps this young person, a young girl, right, or a young boy, want to write poetry himself, and do not force him to learn by heart, which is of course ridiculous. Generally, learning by heart, or Latin or Greek, you have to memorize all these declensions and all these exceptions. Marvelous how it trains your mind. So you wouldn't be really lured by these silly phrases. So that's one thing. And the other thing, I think, is we should debunk this the language, today's language, the jargon, right? We should show how false it is, right? And how it distorts the reality. We should do it. We don't do it. Some of us are trying to do it, but not enough. I think I'm also speaking as a politician. That should be something that the politician and the journalist should do. We are too much dependent on this mendacious language.
Mundus est universitas rerum in quo omnia sunt et extra quem nihil, qui Grece dicitur cosmos. I think we spent an hour together sharing good contents, and it was worth to come together today. Thank you very much, distinguished panelists, for what you said, and I wouldn't say I was missing Lord Scruton here, but I think it was in his spirit as well, what we said.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Hvala lepa družini za povabilo. Upam kmalu na naslednjo podobno konferenco. I wish to continue with such contents in Družina House soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.